This is a story about power and influence, and what can go wrong when private gain triumphs over public interest.
Everything has been done behind closed doors. It reeks of secrecy, it reeks of private interests, undue influence, and cosy relationships, a culture of mateship on a grand scale.
The shining monolith that is Crown Sydney, the city's tallest building, has become a landmark symbol of the power of great wealth.
Money was speaking, and money was getting whatever it wanted.
It's the product of billionaire casino magnate James Packer's grand plan.
This is a great idea. This will be great for Sydney. And there is no one anywhere who's going to try harder than our company to build something special.
It seemed to be a political steamroller. It did seem that it had a momentum, and having had James Packer behind it and knowing his powerful friends, it seemed to me at the time that this was going to happen.
James Packer's promise was for a luxury hotel and casino to lure the wealthiest Chinese gamblers to spend their millions in Australia. Now his dreams and reputation are in ruins, and his casino empire is under siege.
You accept that your conduct in these communications was shameful, do you?
I do.
I think he expressed the view that he was shocked and embarrassed, and he should be.
I think this is the end of the Packers and the Packers' influence in this country.
This is the great tragedy in all this. We're left with, this gigantic block of flats. We look at it, scratch our heads and wonder how in the first place and what might have been if things had been done properly.
Just how this building came to be is an extraordinary story of big money, backroom lobbying and political influence. Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate how James Packer pursued his dream of a Sydney casino to the bitter end. And we expose the wheeling and dealing behind closed doors that helped him do it. The story begins in a luxury harbourside apartment building known as the Toaster. It's the home of one of Australia's most powerful men, broadcaster Alan Jones.
Right, this is where it all happened. So we go in here, it's very easy. I'm there, top of the table, round here, and I say, Premier, you're here, James, you're over there.
In February 2012, Jones hosted a lunch. His guests were his close friend, billionaire James Packer, and the Premier of New South Wales, Barry O'Farrell. And so what do you feed a Premier and a billionaire?
Pies and mash. James loves his pies. The Premier was sort of trying to loosen the waistline, so I'm not too sure whether he accepted the pies, but look, it's very simple, very unpretentious.
James Packer had a grandiose plan that he'd already shared with Alan Jones.
He had this vision for Sydney, and he said, look, everyone knows the Opera House, everyone knows the Harbour Bridge today in the world of the technology today, they can get all that, so that we've got to do more than that, and I want to do something for Sydney. That was basically the premise. And he said, I want it to be a destination, I want it to be a significant place like no other destination, Sydney to be identified with this particular project, and that was it.
Packer had asked Jones to set up the meeting.
He said he'd like to meet Barry O'Farrell, and that was my recollection. So I just invited the Premier to lunch, and we had lunch here, and they met, and away it went.
But to be clear, he outlined his idea to have a hotel and casino at Barangaroo.
Well, yes, in a very vague and general way, because it was vague and general to me. But he's always drawing things, so he had some diagrams and whatever, and showed Barry. And of course, Barry O'Farrell, as I remember, quite rightly indicated. Because we're that kind of city, everything's got to go through about 155,000 regulatory bodies. So Barry made the point that it wouldn't be all that easy, but he embraced the vision, if I could use that cliched word.
Packer's pitch was for a hotel and VIP casino on the harbour aimed at wealthy international gamblers.
As I remember, one of the keys, I think, that James was determined to establish early on that the casino would be, and I'm using my words here now, a passport-oriented casino, so there would only be people who are overseas people who'd come to the destination who would use the casino. That also appealed to Barry O'Farrell. And Barry was impressed by this as the new Premier and so on, that he was someone who was wanting to do something and I guess sort of leave a legacy in a way.
In a little over an hour, the stage was set for a massive deal.
What does that tell you about how things work in New South Wales?
Well, I think it really reeks of very cosy relationships and potentially undue influence between the private sector, influential broadcasters and also the government. When you have meetings behind closed doors around large-scale developments like this, then the public really never gets to know what's being discussed, what deals may be being offered, whether or not preferential treatment is going to be granted, and whether in fact there are advices given as to how to potentially sidestep due process and broad transparency and accountability.
The way in which this process operated was always 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Effectively, a political decision had been made with some key political players, and then after that, it was just going through whatever process was necessary to ensure that it happened. Literally, as I read it, the decision was made in that room, and then we went through a public farce for the next 6 to 12 months to make sure it happened.
These sorts of things should be dealt with at arm's length and in full public view. When you've got premiers and officials dealing with applicants who are getting a rails run behind closed doors, who knows what was said, who knows what was promised or offered. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that anything corrupt went on, but this is a very, very poor way for the leader of a government and for a government to conduct itself in a first world country like Australia.
The Packers had dreamed for decades of owning a casino in their hometown of Sydney.
Let's not be insulting. Of course we would love to build the Sydney Casino and of course we would love to operate it.
James had learned the industry at the knee of his father, Kerry.
I spent a lot of time in casinos as a kid with my dad, and I ended up thinking, fuck, this must be a good business. Oh.
Packer's casino empire already stretched from Melbourne to Perth and the booming Asian gambling hub of Macau.
So he was playing in a number of ponds, but at the same time trying to link them. Because, I mean, the idea behind these particularly big gamblers is that they move from casino to casino. And if you have a network of casinos, that's how you actually, in a sense, make a lot of money out of one individual. You take them to all your casinos and they're all linked, they're all marketed in one. It's almost like a sort of frequent flyer sort of situation.
So Sydney really, at that point, was the missing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it was the part of the network that he hadn't filled.
Shortly after the lunch at Alan Jones' apartment, Packer unveiled his plan to the public with a strategic leak to the Daily Telegraph newspaper, the start of a relentless media blitz.
In February 2012, the first plans by James Packer and Crown were leaked to the media. Do you recall what your first reaction was?
Well, I mean, having represented Sydney for a while, I'm used to being taken by surprise, but I think that took the breath away. And then when you interrogated what was going on, it was quite shocking. I mean, the fact that Packer had decided he wanted to have a casino in Sydney, and he was able to say, you know, I have a great reputation for running a casino in Melbourne, and if you want to have a second casino licence here, I'm the one to do it. Certainly convinced the Premier.
The Premier has strongly backed a proposal by James Packer to build a casino at the Barangaroo development on Sydney Harbour.
I think this development could add life to Barangaroo, not only a world-class hotel, but extra jobs and a boost to tourism.
Farrell was then the Premier, and this was seen, I think he came in with the idea of getting Sydney moving. I think the previous governments were talking about Sydney was locked up, and this new government was going to do the opposite. And we were largely behind in all our infrastructure. So under that mantra of getting Sydney going, this idea that the O'Farrell government could start delivering these big public projects where there had been a stasis on it, was really something that he thought was quite seductive to the people.
You're listening to Alan Jones on 2GB 873.
James Packer hit the airwaves on his friend Alan Jones' top-rating radio show.
James Packer is on the line. James, good morning.
Good morning, Alan.
Barry O'Farrell's quoted today as saying that he embraces the plans for the hotel and a second casino at Barangaroo. Have you spoken to him about this?
No, I haven't. I sent him. I have not spoken to him about this, and I haven't seen him. I saw him late last year and did not discuss this.
Packer conveniently forgot the lunch he'd had with Barry O'Farrell to discuss his plans just weeks earlier. He told Jones the hotel would only stack up financially if he was allowed to open a casino there as well.
All of a sudden you had one of the most connected billionaires in the country suddenly coming out and saying they wanted to put $1 billion casino on the shores of Sydney Harbour. Now that came out of nowhere in the eyes of the general public. And, you know, that was a really aggressive pitch from him. And then that was the messaging that was being taken on by the government of the day at the time. You know, almost kind of, oh, ignore the casino over here. What we're getting is a 6-star luxury hotel, and that's what Sydney needs.
Packer's tower was shocking in its scope. More than 5 times the height limit for the area and on land reserved for public open space.
The plans were located on the area that had been dedicated for public parkland. It was public parkland for the public, on public land and on the harbour foreshore, and that was where he wanted his casino to go. And that was about getting those views to the Opera House and to the harbour bridge. And so he wanted it right on the foreshore, and he wanted to go as high as possible to maximise the views for that development.
Packer's proposal completely blindsided the chairman of the New South Wales casino regulator, Chris Sidoti. There was already a casino in Sydney, the Star, that had paid $100 million to the New South Wales government for an exclusive licence until 2019.
So far as we were concerned, it came out of the blue. We'd not heard of any suggestions that there should be a second casino in New South Wales. In fact, there still seemed to be a very strong consensus that one casino was enough. And then all of a sudden we get this proposal, and it seemed from the beginning that it had legs, that it was going to run. From the rumours we were picking up behind the scenes. So it was quite a surprise that this thing seemed to be going so quickly in the circumstances where New South Wales had a firm commitment to one casino only at that stage.
Chris Sidoti says the authority was never even consulted.
We waited. We followed what was happening. We sought information from the government. But essentially at that early stage there was no role for us. This was being decided at the political level. We were not asked for our opinion. We were certainly not asked to conduct an independent inquiry and to report to the government on the desirability of a casino.
Days after the Alan Jones interview, James Packer and Premier O'Farrell met at Parliament House. Advice was prepared by the Premier's department, pointing out that the proposal breached height limits, encroached on public land, and departed from the plan to not have high-rise in that location.
Development of a hotel and casino is not permissible within the open space and public recreation zone.
The proposal is totally inconsistent with the approved concept plan.
You look all around Sydney, and Sydney's got these wonderful public parks that sit on the harbour, and they're much loved by the people. To suddenly change a master plan and put a big private building on a public park is really quite outrageous.
We done?
James Packer hates doing interviews.
As he worked on the New South Wales government behind the scenes, James Packer stepped up his campaign, granting a TV interview to another close media pal.
I am hugely proud of our business. Our business made, in 2011, $340 million after tax. We paid $680 million in tax. So we paid twice as much tax as we made in profit.
A cynical view might be that he was trying to humanise himself a little bit in order to win over the public. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I think he was mindful of the fact that the public should, if he wanted to be involved in Sydney, he had to be seen to be able to explain to people what this was about, basically, and that's what he sought to do. Yes, he was sensitive about unnecessary criticism and an invasion, but he accepted also that that's the price he had to pay. I don't think... He's not the sort of bloke who'd sit down and say, I better do this because this is going to help me get people on side.
With Packer's project still facing significant opposition, Premier Barry O'Farrell came up with a novel solution, which he proposed at another private meeting in his office. The solution was to use an obscure government policy called the unsolicited proposals process.
The unsolicited proposals policy is basically an opportunity for someone with a bunch of money and an idea to come straight to the government and avoid messy things like tenders or public consultation. They literally go straight to the government with what's meant to be a unique one-off proposal.
It also meant the deal could be done without a tender, shutting out competitors.
If it's a project that is considered to be unique and on such a large scale, then it should be going to an open tender process. That's what's going to help protect and guard against the risks of corruption and misconduct if there is an open, clear and competitive tender process.
The government cleared the way further for James Packer when it watered down its own rules.
The rule itself, the unsolicited proposals rules, were actually amended to do away with the requirement for an independent evaluation of the deal to in fact see whether or not it did qualify for, if you like, an exemption from an open tender process.
Barry O'Farrell insisted the changes were minor and the timing a coincidence.
It seemed to be a political steamroller. There was very strong support in influential sections of the media, and this was being promoted very heavily throughout the period where supposedly this proposal was under consideration. It did seem that it had a momentum, and having had James Packer behind it and knowing his powerful friends, it seemed to me at the time that this was going to happen.
What do you think the government should have done at that point?
When it received the unsolicited proposal from Mr Packer, it should have announced an independent judicial inquiry into, firstly, whether New South Wales desirably should have a second casino or not. And then second, if the inquiry had recommended a second casino and if the government had accepted that advice, there should have been a public tender process, simply to test whether what Mr Packer was proposing was giving New South Wales the best deal.
It was extraordinary, and it's something that I would not have expected to see in Australia. The first thing that struck me was the lack of an open tender process for what is essentially a duopolistic license in Sydney.
A license to print money.
A license to print money.
As Crown formally lodged its proposal, it embarked on a massive lobbying campaign. James Packer had hired two former Labor Party power brokers, Mark R. Bibb and Carl Bitar, and set about lobbying their former colleagues in the opposition. If the government agreed to a casino licence, Labor's support would guarantee it would be approved by the Parliament.
Mark Arbib is the consummate Labor numbers man. It's always been his job to get the numbers for whatever faction he was throwing his weight behind within the Labor Party when he was working as an official. And literally, he was poached. No doubt it's a smart political play, but poached by James Packer to do that, to get his casino through. I mean, Mark Arbib is this kind of political animal who literally works one side of the aisle one day, works the other side of the aisle the next day. But he's good at getting the numbers, and that's what he was paid to do.
Packer also directly lobbied the then New South Wales Labor leader John Robertson and Environment spokesman Luke Foley. Shadow Treasurer at the time, Michael Daly, remembers being briefed by Crown executives.
Crown walked in the front door. They made an appointment. We want to see you, to give you the sales pitch, if you like, give you the details about the casino. And we had a meeting in the boardroom with several shadow ministers. That was it as far as I was concerned.
So we've been told that within Shadow Cabinet, only one, maybe two people really spoke out against this proposal.
It's nearly a decade ago, so I don't recall the gory details of what was discussed in Shadow Cabinet. The one feature I do remember that was discussed heavily was poker machines. And we came to a pretty quick conclusion that they were off the table.
Labor backed Crown's plan after being assured there would be no poker machines. James Packer also tried to win over the puritanical Upper House MP Fred Nile, who'd spent several decades railing against the evils of gambling.
Mr Sin, Mr Vice, all operate from Sydney. Sydney is the centre of organised crime. To have a casino in this area was playing right into the hands of these men.
I distinctly remember being in my office and looking out in the corridor, and I saw this posse heading down the corridor to Fred Nile's office. Now, Fred Nile is meant to be an anti-gambling, anti-smoking, anti-drinking advocate. And I remember the posse going down, James Packer and two others with him, and they went into Fred Nile's room.
They were very polite, and they certainly weren't doing anything to sound like they were pushing me around, because they knew on my previous record that would not get them very far with me. They'd have to convince me that this casino had some positive value to the people of New South Wales, and I couldn't see any value at all.
At Sydney Town Hall, James Packer even lobbied one of his most vocal critics, Independent Lord Mayor Clover Moore.
And he was travelling around with two Labor Party heavies, probably to get the others on side, you know, Mark Kalpitar and Mark Arbib. They sat at the end of that table quietly while he told me about his fantastic proposal, but I was really concerned about it. And he said to me, "Lord Mayor, I am so grateful. Both the government and the opposition support my casino." And I said to him, well, they shouldn't have, because that's public land and the public haven't been consulted. He didn't stay long after that.
The government decided to move the proposal to the next stage. The night before the announcement, it prepared a press release with the news. Documents obtained under Freedom of Information show the head of the Premier's department, Chris Eccles, sent the draft release to Crown's Chief Executive Rowan Craigie for approval.
Draft release, yet to be finally cleared with the Premier. Thanks, Chris. Could you please call me, read the attached suggested amendments?
Most of Crown's changes were included in the final release issued to the media.
Sharing of the media release before it was published is not unusual. That does happen. What is, I think, alarming is that Crown was able to edit the media release, as has been reported, and it raises questions as to whether or not really Packer was putting words into the Premier's mouth. That, I think, is the alarming aspect of it, and is another indication of these cosy relationships, the culture of mateship that exists between powerful individuals and government.
The Premier made the announcement the next day.
This has moved to the next stage. It is about trying to ensure that Sydney attracts investment. It is about trying to ensure that we get value for money for the taxpayers. It's about the creation of jobs. It's about growing the tourism sector.
Big day for them, Packer.
That night at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, James Packer was the guest of honour at a flashy business dinner. In the crowd were his loyal lieutenants, Mark R. Bibb and Rowan Craigie, the Crown Chief Executive who'd polished the Premier's media release the night before.
If you'll take your seats.
Understandably, James Packer's mood was victorious.
My great pleasure to introduce James Packer tonight.
This is a great idea. This will be great for Sydney. And there is no one anywhere who's going to try harder than our company to build something special. This is more than economic for our company. We are going to try and build something special.
And there's been a lot of attention given to the obviously highly efficient lobbying that Crown has done. You personally have been very involved, according to reports. How much political muscle has Crown had to flex to pull this off?
I think that that's one of those things that's easy to say, and people might imagine that there's some reality to that. What has achieved the outcome today, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Labor Party for not playing party politics, and I'm incredibly grateful to Premier O'Farrell and to the Liberal Party for doing what he did today. But what has got us where we got to today is not lobbying, it's the strength of a really good idea.
James Packer admitted a casino without poker machines was a risk.
There has never been a casino in the world built for $1 billion without slot machines. So, we're entering virgin territory.
On Sydney Harbour, James Packer tried to neutralise one more opponent during a lunch on his $50 million super yacht. Star Casino chairman John O'Neill was James Packer's bitter rival. He'd been lobbying the New South Wales government hard to reject Crown's plan for Barangaroo. Crown and the Star were also going head-to-head in Queensland for a casino licence there. According to O'Neill, James Packer proposed a deal to carve up the Australian casino market between them, potentially illegal behaviour.
So the way the story goes, or the way it's been told by O'Neill, was that the deal would be that O'Neill and Star wouldn't make any trouble for Packer and his attempts to get the second casino licence. So basically hands off in Sydney, and when the Queensland licence comes up, for which they would both be eligible to bid, we won't go into Queensland. We'll let you have Queensland, so we'll basically do a territorial carve-up.
As I understand it, Mr O'Neill rejected it as being inappropriate and couldn't believe his ears, I think. Something like that was said.
What was the essential problem, though?
Oh, the potential for basically cartel behaviour by players in the market, controlling the market in an agreed way that wasn't transparent or, in effect, regulated by the authorities, and coming to private agreements about how they would, in effect, rig the market or manage the market.
And that's potentially illegal?
Well, that is absolutely illegal, yes.
Crown denies Packer proposed such a deal, but O'Neill told a journalist whose story caught the attention of the corporate watchdog.
It then led to an investigation by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, who ultimately found they didn't have enough evidence to go on. Basically, it was, his word against his, and it didn't go anywhere in the end.
In July 2013, the government announced it intended to give Packer his casino licence.
$34 billion. That's estimated to be the worth of the high roller Asian VIP gaming market. And at this stage, Australia has just 1% of that market.
Crown was offering to pay the New South Wales government at least $1 billion in taxes over the first 15 years. The Premier was later questioned about the deal.
Premier, can we talk about the casino for a minute? Can I ask you, when did Mr Packer first raise with you the idea of a casino at Barangaroo?
I'm pretty sure that the first that I saw it was when it was the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, and I then made the comments that I did that then caused some controversy.
You've changed my question. I asked you when did he first raise it with you. You then answered me the first that I saw it was on.
Well, I know. I'm just trying to recollect. I'm not trying to dissemble here, Dr. Kay. I've had 2 meetings with Mr. Packer. I think the first was after the newspaper report, and then the second was in September of last year.
O'Farrell had apparently forgotten about the lunch at Alan Jones' apartment.
Check the time frame while we're talking, so we'll come back to the next section. So,
within a year, O'Farrell would resign as Premier over another memory lapse. The gift of a $3,000 bottle of wine from a lobbyist. New laws allowing Packer's Casino sailed through Parliament with Labor's support.
There was probably going to be some pockets of resistance in the Labor Party about a casino because of the social harm that comes with a casino. And Mark Arbib was critical for ensuring those pockets of principal resistance were overrun by the Labor machine. That's what he does. He gets the Labor machine to drive in a particular direction, and in this case, the Labor machine locked in and rolled in favour of James Packer's Casino.
James Packer still needed approval for the building that would house his hotel and casino. The design was for a 275-metre tower, Sydney's tallest, and dozens of luxury apartments. It had now grown even taller than Packer's original proposal, by about an extra 20 stories.
The building was too large. It was too far north. The buildings were supposed to scale down to the north and to the public spaces, and this was scaling up. The podium was huge. I tried to explain to the board that, it's sort of like bigger than the Opera House, and the height, the bulk, overshadowing, all of those sort of impacts that it had, it was like a building that was far too big for the site.
Architect Kerry Clare was the Sydney City Council's representative on the board of the Barangaroo Delivery Authority, the government agency responsible for development at the site. She opposed the design and said it should be independently reviewed.
It was proposed for a clear public park area. So therefore, the 270 metres height, and none of that had been contemplated or previously approved. So it was a major change to the Barangaroo approvals. It's not an iconic building. It's an iconic representation of a bad process.
When her comments appeared in a newspaper, she received a furious call from a senior bureaucrat.
Basically, he was very angry and spoke to me quite forcefully for about 25 minutes. He was threatening, definitely, and I was made to feel like I had actually done something very wrong.
Kerry Clare says she was even threatened with possible criminal charges. How did that make you feel?
Well, I thought it was strange that I was threatened with something that was a criminal offence for something that was quite innocuous.
How did that change your willingness or ability to speak out on issues?
Well, it certainly changed my ability because they added a clause to the Code of Conduct saying that no board member could speak to the press. Everything had to be directed to the chair or the CEO.
So they really gagged the entire board?
Basically, they closed down any discussion.
Construction on James Packer's crowning glory at Barangaroo began in 2016. Just as it got underway, disaster struck. 19 Crown employees in China were arrested and 16 eventually jailed for illegally promoting gambling.
Some Chinese staff members already on bail walked free from the court. Others will spend another month behind bars.
It was devastating for Crown's core strategy of luring Chinese high rollers to Australia.
wasn't a good story, and given the business model for Barangaroo was going to be high rollers and a big link to the Chinese community, the alarm bells started to tingle.
So, including about the potential viability?
Well, if the company was being accused by the Chinese government of acting illegally in China, and that was part of its plank in terms of its business plan, then that would obviously be of concern to us.
It was a phenomenal crisis for Crown. It was a real problem. Firstly, it exposed what they were doing, and secondly, and for them probably more importantly, it blew up that strategy.
Mr. James Packer.
The scandal led to the collapse of Crown's lucrative joint venture in Macau with gambling tycoon Lawrence Ho.
The ability to have an outlet in Macau means that players could deposit funds into the casino Macau and be able to play in Australia. So it was a huge part of the business. And so having to withdraw or pull out of Macau means that they lost that huge, important, weapon or tool in the armory.
His empire under pressure and battling serious mental health problems, James Packer began looking for a way out of the casino business altogether.
I think James was hoping that when the arrests in China settled, that was 2016, that over time that the Asian players would come back. And they did to some extent, but it was never like it was. So I think that it was when he came to that realisation that he thought, why am I even here? I could make more money somewhere else.
Packer tried to sell just over half of his Crown shares to his old friend and business partner, Lawrence Ho. But Lawrence was the son of Stanley Ho, a notorious casino kingpin linked to organised crime and banned from any involvement with Crown.
So there was an uproar about that, and there was a regulatory issue around that. And it was clearly set off alarm bells with the New South Wales gambling regulator.
Our concerns were that Mr. Lawrence Ho was involved with that company. So alarm bells started to ring because nobody consulted us. Crown didn't consult us about the transaction.
The gambling watchdog appointed former Supreme Court Judge Patricia Bergen to conduct an inquiry. After media allegations of criminality at Crown Melbourne and Perth, the inquiry also examined whether Crown was suitable to keep its Sydney casino licence.
So I call James Packer.
Yes, Mr. Packer. Can you hear me?
James Packer gave evidence via video link from his super yacht somewhere in the South Pacific.
Mr. Packer, would you please state your full name?
James Douglas Packer.
Mr. Packer, do you agree that the grant of a licence to operate a casino is a privilege? And do you accept that with the grant of that privilege come a number of important obligations on the part of the casino operator?
Yes, Michelle. A lot of the things that I've seen or heard in this inquiry have been a total shock to me.
I thought that James's evidence was really quite sad, and he personally expressed his upset and remorse over what the Bergen inquiry was uncovering, and I think he found it very embarrassing. But it needed to be done. I don't think he's a very well man, so I think he expressed the view that he was shocked and embarrassed, and he should be.
Just after Christmas, Crown Sydney finally opened, but with no casino. In February, the inquiry handed down its findings. It said Crown had facilitated money laundering and partnered with companies linked to organised crime.
Crown Resorts was today dealt its biggest blow. Its gaming rooms in Sydney will remain empty for now after the company was deemed not fit to hold the licence for its third Australian casino.
It seemed to be at times profit at any cost, and so there was probably a certain air of arrogance about it, and the company used to getting its own way, and not only in its how it conducted its business, but how it dealt with governments. It was very adversarial right through the inquiry, and as matters transpired, it looked like they had things to hide, and they did.
Crown is now fighting to salvage its licence. It has restructured its management, and James Packer's influence has been vastly diminished. He's given up his right to appoint directors until 2024.
The company is nothing like it looked a year ago, and a lot of the people who were there making key decisions and managing have gone. And it's all about the quality of the people they're replacing them with. And I've got no complaints about any of the people that they've engaged or employed or appointed. They look pretty good. And we've neutralised a big issue, which was the Packer influence on this company.
There are now royal commissions into Crown in Victoria and Western Australia. The company's accounts and culture are also being audited. The New South Wales regulator is watching closely.
To the extent that something comes out that's a big issue for us in New South Wales, our rights are preserved under our regulatory powers anyway, and if we need to, we'll serve another notice.
So right now, what chance do you give Crown of being able to open its casino in Sydney?
Oh, high chance. I'm seeing a company that's quite different, but I do need these audit tick-offs first.
If and when the casino does open, Crown Sydney's high roller business model is now in serious doubt.
It's a total mess. There is that enormous building sitting there. Yes, it's got a 6-star hotel in it and lots of luxury apartments. Presumably, Crown as the developer is making some money out of it. I don't know whether it's operating at a loss or not. With the collapse of international travel and particularly the Chinese gambling market, which predates COVID, it has to be said, I would have, having seen none of the figures, I would have real doubts about the financial viability of Barangaroo.
Crown says it has sold more than $870 million worth of luxury apartments at Barangaroo, including a $60 million penthouse bought by James Packer. So this is the finished development. What could have been here?
Well, this is the area that was earmarked for a wonderful community park and a large expansive area where workers in the city buildings could come down at lunchtime, much as they do on the western side of the city in the Domain, where they go down and they run around and kick a ball. So it could have been a beautiful park for the people.
And what have we ended up with?
Well, an international hotel, apartments for the mega rich, and perhaps a casino.
This is the great tragedy in all this. We're left with, this gigantic block of flats. We look at it, scratch our heads, and wonder how in the first place and what might have been if things had been done properly.
James Packer is considering selling out of the company he founded altogether. A bitter final chapter in what was meant to be his crowning glory.
The Crown saga is basically the end of the Packers in Australia, and I would say that that is the most significant thing that's probably happened in sort of business/society for a long time. Australia is a very different country without a Packer somewhere in the epicenter of its influence.
James will be back, the kids are growing up and so on. He hasn't abandoned Sydney, but I think until this is resolved, he won't be coming back.
What's concerning is not just the development itself, it's the process or the lack of process that sits behind it. The fact that this could be given the green light without adequate community consultation really sends alarm bells that if it could happen on Sydney Harbour, it could happen anywhere.
That building should stand as a warning to every government, to everybody in every town and every city in this country of what happens when you give up the public good, the public interest for private gain. And we should look at that building and forever know that we should never let that happen again.